This is the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. Hello everyone, welcome to the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. My name is Angelica Solinska and I'm your host. And today I'm joined by Cheryl Warren. Thank you, Cheryl, for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.
So Cheryl is a trainer and consultant, and she works with early childhood settings across the UK, so travelling up and down lots. And today we're going to be discussing reaction versus response, stimming and behaviour. So mainly kind of those three things, but really going into a little bit more depth into all of them, I guess, but how really looking at how they interlink as well. So perhaps we could begin with taking a look at why do we need to understand the difference between an adult's reaction versus their response to a child's behaviour? Like why is that different?
Okay. I think just the word behaviour, I think, has so many kind of connotations to it. People are coming at their response to behaviour based on their own experiences, the way that they were raised as a child, their own cultural expectations, all sorts of things can factor in how we believe children should behave. And more often than not, it's that actually is prompting our reaction to the children's behaviour in front of us. Now, as you said, I work with nursery settings across the country, and educators out there are absolutely fantastic. The knowledge of child development is really, really strong. And there is that understanding of, in terms of the behaviour that we see, is that age and stage appropriate for our children? And okay, so let's come at it from a slightly different space. My role and my focus also is looking at our neurodivergent children, our children of difference. And that's when we may see the behaviours that we wouldn't necessarily expect developmentally our children to be having in front of us. So when I'm out and about, I'm very much talking about your response or your reaction to the behaviours that you are seeing in front of you. So a reaction is very much that kind of instant emotional reaction to what is happening in front of you. Quite often there's very little kind of intentional thought to your next step or your next move in how you are going to approach that child and deal with that situation. And like I say, it's quite often based on our previous experiences or our preconceived ideas. So it's that immediate reaction to
is it almost like a bit of a like an impulsive kind of behaviour,
that kind of immediate reaction. Child's doing X, I need to do Y in order to stop that behaviour happening in front of us.
And is it it's quite subconscious as well then, isn't it, I guess?
Yeah, very much. It kind of comes from, like I say, quite our sort of, like I say, our experiences. So it's in there. Sometimes we're not even necessarily kind of putting any process of thought to that reaction. And to a point, we have to do that sometimes with our children if we perceive our children to be in immediate danger. So if we're out and about with a group of children and our child's just about to go and put a step into the road, we are going to react immediately without thought, just I need to keep that child safe. And there are those reactions. Certainly when we are considering how we are supporting, understanding our neurodivergent children, so our children of difference, the response is the better approach to have rather than the reaction. And through that response, the response is very deliberate. It is very much more considered. It's very much more made in that conscious thought. And it's an intentional response to what's happening in front of us. And it just gives us that thinking and that process time to kind of analyse what's going on, what was the potential trigger, who's around, what's the situation that we are in, who is the child that is behaving this way in front of us, what do I know about that child, Do I understand their sensory profile? Do I understand their triggers? Do I understand what dysregulation looks like for that child? Am I aware of something that has happened within the environment from a sensory perspective? Has somebody just kind of raised the bell or the kind of sound for a transition, and that's kind of been a trigger? What is it that's happened? And if we can, and sometimes, I mean, I'm not saying that we have to go away for 5 minutes and think about all of those things. They can, once we get to know our children, those things can kind of come quite quickly. But if we give ourselves just that sometimes 5-10 second, okay, what's gone on? We can actually approach the situation from a better standpoint. We can respond with intention by looking at that wider picture as to what's gone on in front of us. And I always talk about making sure we understand the why behind the behaviour. You know, the phrase challenging behaviour. Behaviour is only challenging to us as the adult. For that child, certainly that child that may have underlying or a diagnosis of a neurodivergent condition, we need to understand their sensory profile and the impact of the nervous system when it's in its sympathetic or parasympathetic state, that fight or flight response. If we understand the why, we respond better, we respond with conscious thought, therefore we are better able to support our child in that moment, and then potentially help the rest of our colleagues to understand what that child might need from us in that moment. Yes,
so it's very...
there's a definite difference between a reaction and a response, and we need to support our children to feel safe and all of those things, and the more we understand our child, the more we are better able to respond.
So a response then is a lot more personal rather than the reaction being kind of generic and, like you say, just more impulsive.
This is how children should behave. This is how they should all conform and respond and comply. And, you know, this is what actually my response is based on what I understand about that child. And quite often that, I mean, people talk about behaviour as communication, and to a point, yes. But it also, the behaviour that we see in a lot of our neurodivergent children is actually just a safety response. The body is going into fight or flight. So they have no control over what's happening. Their brain has literally gone into survival mode. If we understand that, we're better able. So definitely coming from that deliberate, connected, supportive space and that conscious thought with the behaviour that we're seeing in front of us and how we respond to it.
And I think that's really interesting what you point out in terms of behaviour not always being communication. I guess it's not conscious communication. It's probably communication to us as adults, kind of saying, you know, this is what the child is experiencing or feeling, but the child isn't consciously communicating that. So I guess it's helpful understanding that it's out of the child's control, perhaps, and it's not a conscious kind of behaviour, perhaps, that they're displaying.
No, definitely. And we just need to, you know, I've popped something out on social media today about the sensory profile, and really supporting our understanding of our children who are sensory seekers and who are sensory avoiders. That often comes out in their play and their behaviour. And rather than trying to stop those behaviours, is understanding the reasons behind those. And then we're more able then to provide that safe environment, that enabling environment where all of our children can thrive. And if our children are, you know, I spoke about the nervous system. If our children are in that parasympathetic nervous system, that state, they're feeling calm, they're feeling regulated. Therefore, our children are able to go off and explore and be curious and engage and connect and thrive and develop and progress. And that's what we want for our children, to be able to have that safe space for them to be able to do that. But we have to understand our children before we can provide that space. So if we come at it from a different angle, we can better understand our children.
And it makes me think that it's not only understanding each individual child, it's also having an understanding of that, of particular neurodivergences as well. So I think it may often help to realise that a child is displaying certain behaviours which actually match to a certain neurodivergence, and they are characteristics. So it almost, I guess, in a way justifies it, rather than thinking, I have no idea what's going on here. Actually, if a practitioner may be able to connect it to a particular neurodivergence or a condition, then they can kind of see, okay, this is what may be happening here. This may be the reason, and then they can understand how perhaps children with that condition may usually behave. And it's almost like a case study or an example to then use with that unique child.
Yeah, no, definitely. All of these things can be those first identified emerging traits of a potential neurodivergent condition. And we're there, obviously, we're not there to diagnose, but what we are there to do is to kind of bring all this evidence together and create this kind of platform of all this evidence to kind of say, okay, well, in this situation, we saw this, and the child behaves this way and responds this way to a certain stimulus or interaction or engagement or transition, and we gather that information along with what our parents are telling us when their children are out and about in social situations, in public spaces, parents telling us their children are not sleeping, or they have a limited diet, or they seem to run out of the public bathroom when somebody puts the hand dryer on. All of these things are building up a picture for us, which we can then sit down with our Senko, with our senior team, and kind of go, okay, I'd like to just discuss what I have observed in this child, and then we go from there. But if we understand that some of these behaviours are potential indicators and of those emerging traits, then definitely we provide that support then, and we seek guidance from our Senko and local authority, and then we can provide that better space because we understand why that's happening and why the child is behaving that way, responding that way, playing that way. And again, it's not, I always talk about the fact that these things are not wrong. These children are different. Different does not equal less. They're different. And if we understand that there are differences in the way our neurodivergent children play, the way our neurodivergent children behave, respond, then again, we're more able to provide that safe space for them.
And it kind of, I don't know if I'm going a little bit off topic here, but in terms of like labeling, sometimes obviously that's not useful, and there's kind of different stigmas around different kind of neurodivergences, and parents and families often kind of feel uncomfortable with that, perhaps. But I'm just thinking whether it is useful to have that at least in our heads as educators, like I said earlier, because then you were talking about the different indicators. So having an awareness of different indicators will allow us to be more aware of that behaviour, I guess, rather than not quite being sure what you're seeing.
Yeah, it's not about kind of, child not showing any eye contact, they must be autistic. Child lines things up in their play, they must be autistic. But we're gathering information on different situations that our children are in. And we're not here to sit with the parents and kind of say, we think your child is autistic, we think your child has ADHD. That's not our place to say that. We are not trained to do that. But what we can start to identify are some of those emerging traits where that child might require some additional support needs. That child might require the process of a referral to take place to speech and language or OT or pediatrics, and that's where it's definitely it's the point where the practitioner, the room leader, takes things back to the Senko and says, I've identified this, I've observed this, can we have that discussion? We've identified that this child might have this spiky profile. Can we just have a chat about it? And then it's those conversations. And those conversations are tricky with parents. I've been on the other end of that conversation for both of my children. And I knew my eldest son was autistic. I identified it just over 2. And I kind of that's his autism. Before there was even a diagnosis, I was starting to identify, starting to build up that picture myself. But that moment, that professional told me that my son was autistic, broke me. I knew, but it broke me because I'm hearing it out loud. So we have to, when we're working with parents, I know it can be really, really tricky when you're trying to bring in those interventions or support, or those additional support needs for the children that you have in your setting, and parents are saying, no, don't want to talk about it. No, I think you're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore we can't make that referral because we haven't got the parents' permission. And I know that's really, really tricky. We have to understand, and I hate the X factor term, but the journey that the parents are on. And we have to, as well as I talk about meeting the child where they are, we also have to meet the parents where they are. And as well as providing that connective relationship and that positive connected relationship with the child, provide that for your parents as well, because then you will become their trusted adult. So they will then feel able to talk to you when things are tough, when they've had to leave their shopping trolley in the middle of Sainsbury's or Tesco's again because the child hasn't managed to do a full shop with them, or they have walked into a social event, a family party, and within 10 minutes they've had to leave because the child's having a meltdown on the floor because there's just too many people, too many different smells and too much going on in the room. That's when those parents will start having those conversations with you. But we can still provide, no matter whether or not we've got parents' permission for a referral or a discussion with an outside professional, we can still do what we can in terms of providing that safe space for the children. So we can still observe their meltdowns or their response to sensory stimulus. We can still understand the sensory profile of our children. We can still understand what dysregulation looks like and how best as a team we can support that child. We can still provide that calming, low arousal, neutral space, and then that place of escape where children can go to decompress when things get too much. We can still do all of those things whilst you are taking and working with your families through that journey of acceptance for them. And some parents don't want to have a diagnosis given to their child, and that's okay. We can talk to them about the reasons why it's beneficial in terms of going forward. Additional support can come in, additional professionals can come in to really enable your child to reach their full potential and to thrive, and maybe seek that support in school. We know early years is very different to a school environment. We've got 30 children in the class, one teacher, one TA, and children can get quite lost and very misunderstood in a school classroom. But again, that's the prerogative of those parents. And I hear, parents are in denial. Oh, it's so hard, and I get it. I do. I've been a practitioner myself. I get it. But think about it from the parents' perspective and how hard that conversation is, and just maybe come at it from a different space with that little bit of extra empathy and understanding, I guess.
Just quickly, I wanted to thank all the listeners for tuning into the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. Those of you who are regular listeners will know that a new episode comes out every Monday morning, ready for your commute, morning coffee, or that reflective start to the week to get you thinking and in the zone. If you haven't already done so, it would really help this podcast to keep going if you subscribe to the channel that you're listening on. The Voice of Early Childhood podcast can be found on 19 different podcast platforms and on YouTube. So it's highly likely that you, your friends, and colleagues can find it on your favorite streaming platform. So please do hit the subscribe button, and this will help us to keep putting out thought-provoking, reflective, and insightful episodes with a wide range of guests. Thank you. I'll let you get back to the episode now. Yeah, and I guess, like you said earlier, because you've been on that side, you've been that, and you still are that parent with a child who's neurodivergent, you really do have that understanding. So it's probably a lot more difficult for educators to understand when they've not been through that, especially if they don't have their own children at all. And just going back to your own personal experience, why did you find it so challenging to hear that your child was actually, formally diagnosed with neurodivergence?
I think because in your head you're still thinking, because there are points in the process where you're told that, it might be your parenting, it might be because the child doesn't do that, he doesn't behave like way here. So you're still in your head, you're thinking, okay, well, is it me? Is it? So I think it kind of had, there was two elements to it really. I think it was the first being, I've got this professional using that word. I've got it written on paper in front of me in black and white. I'd only ever said it before, and it almost feels okay if it's, oh, it's, it's just this, it's just that. And maybe in the back of my head, I always thought, okay, he might not be. It might just be that this is a kind of stage we're going through. And although I think deep down I probably knew that it wasn't, I was definitely building up this picture, and other people, nurseries, were kind of starting to kind of make the kind of indication to me that they were identifying some things within nursery. And I think for me, he's now a very tall, grumpy teenager. It was a long time ago now. Things were different back then. He was 6. And it was a year's process back then. I know for some families it is a lot longer now. And I think it was also that kind of, as well as, I'm not sure I want to hear it out loud, I think there was also that relief, like you, that actually these behaviours and our life so far with him has been this way because of this. This is why. So I think it was, oh my gosh, I'm now hearing it out loud, and that's really hard, but also a little bit of relief. But then you go through a whole range of emotions after that. You go through, there's grief, there's bereavement, there's worry, there's anxiety, there's fear. And then you kind of go into this lioness mode that I need to protect. And I think there are many parents that are still in that now, fighting for the support that their children need within school.
So it seems like it's mainly that understanding, that knowledge of how difficult and challenging that I guess life will be, or can be, for your child and yourself as well, because you start to understand that because it's here and it's real and it's been kind of communicated to me, it's no longer in my head. It makes it real, the fact that these challenges that you are aware of, that other children and adults face with neurodivergence, they are also going to be something that you and your child or your family will experience.
Yeah, it's tricky, and it just floods. It just floods over you. But then really that's kind of the start of the fight, to be honest. I know when we got his diagnosis, it was, here's a few leaflets, off you go. And you have to find your way, But I'd say we've come out unscathed. We've had some rocky times. But he's literally yesterday started his year 11 GCSE year. So we've done something right. We've got him that far.
Got him free school then.
Just, yeah. Kicking and screaming some days, but we've got him there.
And I just wanted to go back to the conversation around not having a diagnosis, and perhaps some parents and families not being sure about that. So I wondered if there are problems associated with that, in terms of not necessarily not getting the support as quickly, perhaps, or as easily, that the child or young adult requires, but also with the child themselves, especially when they get older, perhaps masking. So really trying to, I guess, adhere to social norms a little bit more, and actually that doesn't really work for them.
No. A masking happens for those with a diagnosis and those without a diagnosis. But I think, it's kind of brought home a lot recently with, I think there's a lot more adults getting a diagnosis, whether that be ADHD or an autism diagnosis. And I know a couple of friends actually who are now saying it's just put the pieces together. It's helped me to understand why my childhood was the way that it was, why I felt the way I did going through school, why I felt like I didn't fit in, why I felt like I was different. So, and that's not because the parents didn't want a diagnosis for many of them. It's just because back then, it wasn't recognised at all. And I think as well now with, there's much more open conversation around it. There are more celebrities that are talking about their own diagnosis, and, programs on the television of the Chris Packham one and masking autism. I think those kind of things are bringing it to people's minds, and they're kind of listening to those podcasts or watching those programs and go, oh, that's me.
I can relate to this.
I can. I tick many of those, and then taking themselves off for an assessment. So I think it's not always about parents that are in denial, but I think the diagnosis, for certainly from what my son has told me, and what friends have told me who have got a late diagnosis, it's helped them to understand who they are. It's part of their identity. So if you live your life without knowing that part of your identity and feeling like you've got to mask, you've got to fit in, you've got to conform, that's why we've got many adults that are now going through that autistic burnout. It's just exhausting. You're spending your entire life pretending to be somebody that you are not, from the moment you wake up and walk out of the front door to the moment you come home. And the first Chris Packham program actually highlighted that. There was a lady that he was talking to, and that was really powerful. And she then went back and had conversations with her mum about her early childhood and things, and for her it was really real. And it was, like I say, it just helped her, and I know certainly with my friends, it's helped them to understand their identity, and just help them to make sense of their world. Really. And I think that from a mental health perspective, I think that's really important.
Yeah. And I've never heard of the term that you just use, like autistic burnout, and it makes a lot of sense. Like, once you said it, I was like, oh yeah, like I really understand that. And is it the case for other neurodivergence as well? So specifically like ADHD, would you kind of say something similar to that exists as well, like that kind of burnout that you may feel?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. Because you are, and it's happening with my son, and we when we're thinking about our children, we quite often call it the Coke bottle effect. So if you've got that bottle of Coke or lemonade that's has got the lid on and is being shaken up all day under stress and under so much pressure to contain itself in that bottle, as soon as that child gets in their safe space, the lid comes off. And the child just explodes, because they now feel that they can be their truest self, because they're not going to be judged or criticized, or they can stim, they can get the fidgets out, they can go and envelop themselves in their blankets upstairs in their hideaway, because they feel safe enough to do it, whereas they've had to, and certainly with him, he's had to contain it. And that's exhausting, because your body and your brain is under constant stress, that high level of anxiety, and being kind of aware and having to kind of, react to situations to go, oh, no, keep that in, keep that in. That's exhausting.
It's a lot of pressure, yeah.
And it's got to come out somewhere. And that's where, with our children with that are having their meltdowns, if we're having to, or our children that are being told to stop stimming, that stress has to go somewhere. So, my children will often talk about stomach aches or headaches or nosebleeds. It will come out physically as well, because the body can't handle and contain that stress for that length of time.
And that's when
all of those indicators, can help identify.
I guess that's when we think, so both as adults and children, we think something's really, really wrong when we see those physical effects, because is that almost like the last straw, like your body really saying, I can't do this anymore, like this needs to stop, or something needs to be addressed here. And it comes out in the physical kind of effects, rather than necessarily the more kind of psychological, perhaps mental, emotional ways.
I think as well, I think we're leaps ahead of where we were years ago in terms of understanding mental health and mental well-being. We seem to be able to understand how to support a child who's having a tummy ache or a headache or a nosebleed. It's that physical thing. So sometimes that can be the bit that people kind of sit up and actually do something about, because, oh, okay, I can deal with the nosebleed. I don't understand the meltdown because I can't see it. I can't see what triggered it. I can't. So yeah, but it has to come out somewhere.
And it's really sad that even now still we don't really see mental health issues and neurodivergences as much as we see the more physical disabilities and perhaps conditions and illnesses. it's something that is far better now than it was before, but because it's not physically visible, it makes it so much harder to be, I guess, accepted, and also feel like you've got a young adult and an adult, I guess, that you've got a justifiable reason to be the way that you are, and it's not just an excuse, and you have got a real reason to be experiencing what you're experiencing.
And I think when we go back to behaviour, and when we're talking about these disabilities, if you've got you're out and about in a social situation with your 8-year-old or your 15-year-old, people would expect them to behave a certain way because they're now, an 8-year-old, and they should know this, and they should be able to cope with this. Or, like I say, my 15-year-old, he is nearly 6'2". He's a big lad. He looks older than 15. He doesn't have the meltdowns that he used to, but when he has them, and certainly when he has them out in public, it's that real kind of looks and judgment and criticism. Why is he doing that?
He shouldn't be doing this at this age, or
he should know better. And that's the difference. And again, the amount of parents that have had their child just having that complete meltdown on Tesco's vegetable aisle, and the looks and the kind of eye rolls, and I mean, I've had it before.
Yeah.
Comments from people, I wouldn't let mine get away with that. Well, because it's that hidden disability. And during COVID, everybody got the sunflower lanyards, and there's the things now up on the tube that say, people might have a hidden disability. So that awareness is starting, but we're still in that awareness phase. Whereas for me, I want to shift people into that acceptance phase. I think once we accept, we're then better able to support our children.
We can then do something about it. And so you mentioned stimming earlier, so I just wanted to kind of go into that. I know that not that many educators actually understand, or perhaps maybe even know, have heard of the word stimming. And I know that a lot of people that I've spoken to outside of education certainly have never heard of stimming. And surprisingly, some mental health professionals that I've spoken to recently also haven't heard of it, which was quite I was quite taken aback by that. But is it something that is more of a new term then? I know I only heard about it a couple of years ago. How long has it been around, and what is stimming?
What is stimming? So it's one of those things that I think, because we're now, more people are talking about it, it's kind of, that's a new thing. If you talk to anybody with a neurodivergent condition that stims, they'll tell you, well, I've always done it.
Yeah.
Something I've always
done. But maybe didn't necessarily have that label.
Aware. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that's what I was doing. So stimming really is there to achieve wellness, regulation, a way of releasing any stress or anxiety, or potentially to kind of cope in really heightened sensory situations. And I know when I've spoken to, and I made a couple of notes because it's really important to kind of hear that autistic voice. I know when I've heard from, and I've asked those with an autism diagnosis specifically, they say that they kind of describe it as taking a breath. So if you were holding your breath in for a long period of time, and all of a sudden it's that kind of release. I feel so much better now. It's that element of recharging. It's that element of calming. But it also can be that real expression of joy, or even kind of meditation, or those kind of things. So stimming can come in lots of different ways. It can be a bit of hand or arm flapping. It could be kind of movements, repetitive movements with your hands. It could be a kind of flicking thing. Could be hair twirling. Could be jumping. Could be spinning. For my son, he paces up and down and makes some vocal sounds. So it's those repetitive behaviours. For some people, it's because they're requiring sensory input, and they want that sensory feedback, whether it be from, something that they can hold or rub or kind of feel within their hands. For others, it could be to help them reduce the sensory input. So for neurotypical people, they are able to potentially filter out and block out some of the sensory stimulus that's coming in. So it might be that there's some birds flying out in my window, or there might be a van that pulls up outside, or I might hear an ambulance go past, but I don't feel stressed about it. I don't feel anxious about it. I'm talking to you and I can still focus on our conversation. But for some people, it may well be that actually, in order for me to block out that noise that's irritating me or that smell I can't cope with, I just need to do something just to help me regulate. I just need to do that repetitive motion just to help me regulate. So we shouldn't be stopping stimming. We should allow individuals to stim. And I've heard so often, I tell the story of when I was at a nursery and the local authority SEN advisor came into the nursery and the Senko was just informing the advisor of this little boy that they had and said that he's a stimmer. He stims, he flaps his hands when he's really, really excited or when he's really, really anxious. We just noticed that it wasn't an issue for them. It wasn't a problem for them. They understood stimming. They understood why. And the advisor said that the child should have their hands placed on their lap and the adult should put their hands over on top because they need to stop doing it because they won't be able to do it when they get to school.
Oh.
Now, that's not right on so many levels. But if we are talking about an activity or that repetitive motion that is required to help an individual to regulate, why would we remove it? Why? Yeah. From a well-being perspective, why would we remove it? We need to understand that behaviour and accept that behaviour, there is a need for that behaviour, potentially an unmet need, and the child has worked out, realised through trial and error more often than not that that's what they need to help regulate. There are some stims that can edge into the dangerous in terms of head banging on the floor or banging their head against the wall or scratching so much that we're kind of impacting our skin and all of those implications. So therefore, we need to support the child in understanding an alternative because it's now unsafe and it's potentially placing the child in a dangerous situation. So we need to, and I would always seek professional help and guidance, maybe with an OT or paediatrician on that. But understand those repetitive actions. It could be that it's a vocal stim as well. I know couple of children that I've seen before will just kind of make kind of or humming noises or tap, 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 tap noises, all of those things. And they can be vocal stims as well. So again, like I was saying right from the beginning, if we understand the behaviour in front of us, we will then make that deliberate response to the behaviour. But yeah, stimming is not every neurodivergent individual stims, but it might be something that we identify in some of our children.
So again, like you said, going back to the beginning, it's so important to be able to tune into every single individual unique child. And like I said earlier, sometimes it's important to be able to understand the different characteristics of different neurodivergence conditions. But even if we don't necessarily know enough about different conditions, it's just important to be able to tune into that child and do what's right for them, not necessarily labeling like we were kind of discussing earlier.
Yeah, no, definitely, all of that, and not see the behaviour as it's the children aren't behaving that way just to wind you up, or they're just wanting some attention, and
they're just being difficult.
Well, you're just being difficult. They're just there to they've just decided that you're their target today and they're going to wind you up. That's just not the case. So if we can ask why, and if we can, like I say, come with that response with a conscious thought, alongside us understanding each of individual child's, like you say, their uniqueness, and our neurodivergent children have beautiful uniqueness. Find what it is. Find what it is for them. Better understand them, and certainly in terms of that sensory profile, it's really key to understand that, because quite often, more often than not, it's the sensory element that you're seeing in the behaviour, that sensory seeking or that sensory avoiding. So the more we can understand that, better.
Well, thank you so much, Cheryl. That's been so interesting. We've picked up a lot of different topics there, kind of going into depth here and there, but it's a really wide kind of focus, and we could talk for hours on this, I'm sure.
On for days.
Well, thank you so much for coming on to the Voice of Early Childhood podcast and sharing this space with me and the listeners. And our listeners can find out more on the Voice of Early Childhood website. And as always, there's going to be a brand new episode next week. And yeah, thank you so much, Cheryl.
Thank you very much for having me. See you later.